So this week, yes, narrow economies, economies that basically just produce one or two things, which, Ricardo would believe is a very good way to operate, versus broad economies, economies that make lots of stuff and generally seem to perform better, but not always. And so we can apply that to companies as well. Companies that diversify very often do very well. But, can we write off Ricardo's theory? And I want to look at that a bit more on the podcast today, exactly, the detail of some of that. But can we write it off entirely? Because there are economies which do very well and are some of the narrowest economies. So take Australia for example, one of the highest levels of GDP per capita. And, it seems to be like a lot of resource-based economies. They just ship stuff out. They don't add value to it. They don't diversify, but they're enjoying very high incomes and high material wealth. So you could say, in their circumstances, Ricardo was right. They don't need to diversify. They are providing what they're good at.
What they're good at is digging holes in the ground and flogging the contents overseas.
Yeah, they're very good at that.
In other words, if you've got a great, if you have physical resources which are needed by the rest of the world, then you can make a fortune out of those. Obviously, the most classic case is not Australia; it's the Arabic countries where the oil was first discovered. Saudi Arabia, it was the only thing Saudi Arabia was known for before oil was discovered was Lawrence of Arabia movies. Now, I mean, that's a bit facetious, but its development's been entirely driven by the fact that you can't produce anything without energy. My classic little one-liner: labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. Energy is provided by everybody. You've got the world over a barrel; they have to buy it. You don't have to export anything back in the opposite direction. You don't have to manufacture anything when you can export something that's so critical for the rest of the world. But again, it's the extent to which that is feasible, the size of your economy. So Russia is equally a huge oil producer, but it has far more people, far more need for infrastructure across the scale of its economy. It doesn't do as well by being an oil-focused economy. But if you have a small population and an incredibly important resource, which you have a comparative surplus of, Australia and the Arabic countries that have oil do very well.
Right. So that is a long way from that to say, well, actually, we've also got a lot of car manufacturing plants and we've got a lot of car designers. Therefore, that's the same as oil. That's a resource that we have, and we can build on that because other countries can't suddenly discover oil. Other countries could say, yes, we're going to make cars. As we've seen, of course, with China, all of a sudden producing electric vehicles and decimating the car industry in many other parts of the world. So which just highlights the risk of following the Ricardian approach, doesn't it? Of do what you're best at.
Look at Ricardo. Ricardo was well put. I mean, Ricardo's a brilliant thinker, no doubt about it. But he was properly put down by Schumpeter for saying that he never really cared about the interconnectedness of everything else. He simply wanted fast, logical arguments in favour of whatever position he was putting forward. And he would make a simplifying assumption, simplifying in inverted commas, on top of another one until such time as the conclusion he wanted was the only conclusion that was left. And this is what Schumpeter called the Ricardian vice. And this lies behind the theory of comparative advantage. So Ricardo was out to abolish the Corn Laws, which actually were brought in fairly late. I didn't realise how late they were until I checked the history recently, but in the 1800s, at the time that he was a member of Parliament, he'd bought a seat in Parliament. And there's an interesting trade. Why don't we bring that back again? Buy your own seat. We might get better people than the ones who win popularity contests. But he wanted to abolish the Corn Laws. And what the Corn Laws did was effectively ban importing of grain from Europe into the UK. Now, Ricardo's logic, and this I think is quite impeccable, was that meant a higher price for food in the UK than if they were bringing in the imports. And that price would be passed on to landlords because, according to his theory, which is not completely correct, but a reasonable starting point, workers were getting a subsistence wage. The cost of subsistence were higher because you had to buy local grain rather than imported grain. That meant that there was more money going to landlords and less to capitalists. You invested less rapidly. And what Ricardo wanted to do was stop that money going to landlords, get it into the hands of the capitalist, and enable a faster rate of industrial development. So that was his objective. Right. And he says that very clearly at one stage in the principles. It has been my objective to show in this book that there cannot be a rise in profits except by a fall in the necessaries for wages. And then if we can cause a drop in the cost of necessaries for workers, you will increase the rate of accumulation.
Right.
So that was his objective. Now, he didn't really care how he got the argument, but he came up with a very clever idea. And I can imagine how this happened, because in the circles, being somebody literally in Parliament, you're having debates with other politicians, they were saying, oh, look, Portugal, at this stage, Portugal was the UK's major competitor. It might seem strange to say, but that was the case back in the early 1800s. It had the dominant empire at the time globally. The UK was rapidly catching up. If we to liberalise trade, Portugal would be better us than everything, and our industry will be decimated and we'll lose out. And he said, aha, I can show that if I assume Portugal's better us, exactly what you're saying, that Portugal is better at the UK at everything, I can show that even if that is true, it's still advantageous to trade. So he made up a numerical example, and this is, I'll bring this in the quotes over here. England may be so circumstanced that to produce the cloth may require the labour of 100 men for 1 year. And if she attempted to make the wine, he was aware that it was pretty crazy to be comparing wine with the UK. If she attempted to make the wine, it might require the labour of 120 men for the same time. To produce the wine in Portugal might require the labour of only 80 and the cloth only 90. So Portugal can produce more cloth, or the same amount of cloth and wine with less workers than the UK in both industries, but comparatively better at wine than cloth. So he then said it would be advantageous for England to specialise in cloth and Portugal to specialise in wine. Now, and he made the case this is not what applies in an actual country. Now, this is where I find it amusing that the insight that Schumpeter had into Ricardo's behaviour. Even Ricardo couldn't bring himself to say the obviously stupid line that's part of this logic. So he said, talking about why it's different between countries than in countries, the difference in this respect between a single country and many is easily accounted for by considering the difficulty with which capital moves from one country to another to seek a more profitable employment, and the activity which it invariably passes from one. Now I'm stopping there. What should be the word he uses next?
Well, from one region to another, is it all?
No, one industry.
Yeah.
Okay, because what he's talking about moving from wine to cloth.
Yeah.
Okay, but he must have said this would be so stupid. If I wrote industry here, people would say, "Oh, come on, you can't argue that a wine cloth can move from the wine industry, a wine press can move from the wine industry and become a spinning jenny in the textile industry." So what he said was the activity which it invariably passes from one province to another.
Right.
Okay. So you can move a wine press from one location in the UK to another. Okay. You can move a spinning jenny from one location. You don't change the industry. But what he's arguing is the shifting from one industry to another. Now that's a fallacy. And the reason it's a fallacy is because he had a model of production in which you can produce output with labour and no machinery.
Right. But I mean, you could do it over time.
There is an industry, it's called Harry Potter.
Right. But you could do it over time. You could make the investment necessary.
No, hang on, mate. Sorry. No, pardon me, you're right. Yes, exactly. You can do it over time. You make the investment. Yeah. Now, is specialising in comparative advantage a way to generate that investment? And the answer is no. Okay, because what you do when you open up trade between two, if there was a big difference in relative productivity between the two countries, as Rick argued, you don't move the existing resources from one industry to another. You destroy the existing resources in one country if you can't actually physically shift the machinery. Sometimes that does happen, but let's rule that one out for a simplifying assumption, a genuine one, that if you cut back wine production in the UK, if it existed, and cut back cloth production in Portugal, you just mean that the machinery for those two industries goes idle. You can't sell it, okay? Nobody wants. If you can't make a money, if you're going to be outcompeted by the other country anyway, why buy it? You know, there are various elements, massive discount in the price and so on, but you end up destroying the capital in that sense. In both countries. And therefore, the only way you can make sure you get growth out of this process is if what you've done causes a high rate of investment. You're spot on. Pardon me for jumping in here, but you're dead right. That's the difference. So we need an investment-based theory. And in that investment-based theory, the whole idea of specialisation collapses because you need to buy the inputs to make investment, which comes from a broad range of different industries.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that broad range of industries, you can't make the investment in the first place.
But the theory was based on full employment as well, wasn't it, really? So, I mean, let's...
In a sense, yeah. No, this is actually where one of the few neoclassicals I like, and that's Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz realised this when he was working for the World Bank, and his children wanted to go at the demo in Seattle back when there was a demonstration against the World Trade Organization. I think it was 1998. And he wrote a book called Globalizations and Discontents. And he said that he worked in country mission after country mission. And all the conventional advice from the World Bank every time was, look, specialise in what you're good at, shut down this industry, liberate resources to move to another industry. He said what would happen without fail is they'd shut down like a textile industry, and the women who used to work in the textile industry would end up on the streets.
Yeah.
It wasn't a case that they got better jobs. So the idea that reallocation of existing resources is how you manage to grow through time is a classic instance of what I've realised is the fundamental error in not just neoclassical economists, but most economists, unfortunately, to believe that what applies at a point in time then gives you the best strategy through time. So through a point in time, all you can do is shift existing resources from one location to another. And that if you were looking at it, if you could actually do that, if you could actually turn a spinning jenny into a wine press, then that would give you a high level of efficiency. In fact, you can't even do that to begin with. But the whole idea that specialisation leads to growth. It's a fallacy that what applies in a point in time applies through time. And that's, in mathematics, that's known as the ergodic fallacy. Because for example, you and I are both in rooms right now, okay? We're both breathing the air in these rooms. What the air we're breathing is trillions of molecules bouncing off each other, giving us the air pressure we feel. And if we wanted to work out the dynamics of that air system by following each individual molecule, the dynamics would be just ridiculous. You could never do it. No computer could ever simulate the motion of every particle in the atmosphere in a small room, just mathematically impossible. But because it's an ergodic process, it means you can forget about the long-term time and just use probability at a point in time, and the mathematics will end up with the same result. That's called an ergodic system. Now, economists in general, this isn't just neoclassicals, the modern monetary theory make the same mistake with their theory on trade. The belief that what applies at a point in time applies through time is only true in systems where the probability distribution at a point in time gives you exactly the same result as following the dynamics over a large period of time. There's a mathematical equation, like it's called Birchhoff's equation, to say that if this is condition true, then you can use what happens at a point in time to guide you through what will happen through time as well. But it's only in things like the atmosphere inside a room, a sealed container, that actually applies. Okay? So they make the mistake of thinking what optimizes at a point in time is the right thing for development through time, and it's completely wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we've seen with China, for example, saying, well, let's deploy building a load of electric vehicles from nowhere because there's a opportunity for doing that while we do everything else. So look, the example I had, and it does all get down to, let's go back to just examining that full employment thing as well, or full availability of resources. So if you've got country A can produce, the example I've got, just to try and keep it simple, with ridiculous comparisons, country A can produce either 200,000 T-shirts or 100,000 computer chips with the same people and the same resources. So for one chip, they can make 2 T-shirts. and country B can produce 80,000 T-shirts or 80,000 chips. They're using up the same resources. So by Ricardian theory, you'd say country B has a comparative advantage because it's a lower opportunity cost for making chips. It can make chips for the same effort that it costs to make a T-shirt. So it's as easy as making a T-shirt, so they should make the chips. And A, which can make 2 T-shirts for 1 chip, should focus on making the T-shirts. That's the logic, isn't it, behind Ricardian theory?
That's the basic logic. Yeah.
But
and
prices are a factor in all of this, and also employment. So for all of that to work, if country B, which is making T-shirts and chips for the same amount at the same level, and there was demand for both of them, they had unending employment and resources, they would just be saying, well, okay, no, we're not going to specialize in making chips. We're going to make as many chips as there's demand for, and we're going to make T-shirts as well. And country A, you're just horrendously expensive. You know, they might be able to, unless, of course, country A says, well, actually, we're making them at half the price that you're making them at.
Well, again, it's not the allocation. I think another analogy to try. I hate working in analogies, but again, if you wanted to say what's the best way to develop your body over time, then you'd say, well, what gives me more utility? And lying in a beanbag, getting stoned, drinking fine wine, and listening to great music gives me more utility than working out at the gym for the same length of time. So therefore, to develop over time, I should lie in a beanbag, drink fine wine, get stoned, etc., etc. You end up with a body that looks like the beanbag over time if you do that. So what optimizes your utility at a point in time is not the way you should develop to become a functional human being over time. And it's the mistaking that allocation of existing resources to creating new capabilities. That's the mistake that economists have made. And I said it's a common mistake in economics. It isn't just neoclassicals who make it. It's being unaware of the difference between a process through time and an allocation of resources.
So, in other words, you're a country that has focused on doing something. Like, for example, Australia's a good example on this, isn't it? Dig it up and ship it out because they can. But when there's less demand for what they dig up and ship out, I mean, they've been saved, haven't they? Because they've got rare earth minerals, so they're going to,
The resources help them out all the time.
Yeah. But if there was less demand for those resources, then they would be really stuck by the fact that they haven't diversified. So and the same for countries that were developing products which maybe were less dependent on resources that were intrinsic to their country, and they just haven't moved on. I mean, that's what it gets down to, isn't it? If you follow Ricardo, you just don't move on.
Yeah, you haven't developed in any sense. In fact, if you've just laid back and bought the imported goods from somebody else, you've reduced your domestic productive capability. But this is the common fallacy that economics makes, and this, where neoclassicals are particularly troublesome, is that they'll make an argument about reallocation of resources, not explain the logic to the people listening to it, and it sounds like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, comparative advantage, cut back barriers, will grow more rapidly. But they assume that the macroeconomy takes care of itself. So I had many exposures to this, of course, but I ran a conference in Australia in 1980 called Trade to Whose Advantage, and it looked at the fact that the countries in Asia which were developing were doing it by bringing in foreign multinational corporations and having them relocate production to the country and then export from there. But we got what's called the Industries Assistance Commission, which was the government body that decided on tariffs, gave a presentation at the conference as well. And they talked about how a 25% tariff cut for Australia's foremost protected industries at the time, this is 40 years ago, so tariffs are more significant today. They said, this idea is illustrated by a table that shows the results, and you had a fall in some industries. So textiles was one of the industries which got slashed. So there'd be a fall in prepared fibres, a fall in cotton and silk, wool, textile finishing, yada, yada, yada. There'd be gains, on the other hand, on sheep, cereal, meat, cattle, poultry, etc., which is pretty much the direction you can see Australia's gone in. Anyway, they said the main assumptions underlying the computations are A, good macroeconomic management prevails throughout. B, the adjustment takes place over a period of about 2 years, so that changes in the capital equipment of different industries over the adjustment period may be neglected. So the second assumption means we're leaving out issues with capital formation. And the first assumption, we pushed them on that. What does assuming good macroeconomic management mean? What it meant was we assume no change in aggregate employment because of the tariff cut.
Right.
Mic drop, but this time you smash it in the audience's faces. You don't just drop it on the floor. So they make these crazy assumptions. People think they've reached it by logical reasoning. They haven't. They've made a logical error of some sort, and then they've made compensating assumptions around the outside to give them numbers.
All right. So it's interesting you mentioned tariffs, because we'll talk about that a little bit when we come back. But this need for diversification, which is where we're leading to. I mean, it applies in the corporate world, and we embrace it. And yet it's one of those things where what happens in the corporate world, we spoke a while ago about how, corporations plan, and we don't expect economies to be planned in quite the same way. Well, the same thing, I think, applies when we look at diversification versus specialization. So let's examine that a little bit when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. Stay with us. So, Steve, the best example of diversification, whether it's a country or a company, is obviously Amazon, because Amazon started, in effect, as a bookstore. Now they sell everything, but they don't just sell stuff. They own a lot of the infrastructure, not just for themselves, but I think basically a third of the internet now runs off the infrastructure for what used to be a bookstore.
Yes, that's right.
So that is it's got a turnover of $640 billion, which is about the same as Sweden or Thailand or Argentina, the GDP of those countries. If it was a country, it would be the 21st largest economy in the world. And it got that by diversifying. I don't think they would have got to that size as a bookstore.
Oh, no way. Yeah. This is the sign of corporations, which actually are command systems internally. Yeah. They're not markets at all. They work out the more that they can, not necessarily. There was a great trend to outsourcing for a while. What Amazon did is insourcing, going against conventional economic theory again. Same thing for Musk with Tesla. The fact that they produce so much internally means that they can innovate more rapidly because they're not relying upon third-party providers to meet specifications they've made that they don't necessarily meet, and so you lose an enormous amount of time trying to get people to do what you've contracted them to do. In the side of the phones, just do it this way, and you get that capacity to minimize your costs by controlling your manufacturing process. So it's and the trouble is this thing about specialization is one of those things that appeals to us at a simplistic level because, for example, I'm a terrible art carpenter. I'm a terrible carpet layer. I'm an okay economist. Okay? So I don't do the renovations around the house. I hire somebody, and frankly, my wife does half of them. She's more mechanical than I am. And that's makes sense. If I got it, I'd stuff things up anyway. And it's more efficient for her to specialise in what she's good at and me. So that's the sort of thinking we go into. But when you live in a community, in which that's what a country is, the idea that the community should lose a particular skill and then acquire that stuff from another community can mean that you might need that skill sometime in the future and you no longer have it.
Well, I mean, that would have been like a country of economists. Imagine that.
Look, I'd love it. And you wouldn't even need to bomb it. They'd probably kill each other.
They certainly wouldn't get the carpet laid or
themselves for that matter, but that's another story.
Too. Yeah. Who'd want to do that? Yeah. But I mean, also, fundamental things like, getting food and stuff just wouldn't happen as well. So, I mean, that is the problem is it applies, as you're saying, it applies very well at the individual level, but it doesn't apply
but not as a collective. And that's when you look at the data, that's what comes through. That's why I've got my objections to various elements of it, but the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which uses the SITC database of trade structures to imply what the industrial structure of an economy is. Of course, the more you have domestically oriented manufacturing, the less the SITC tells you about your proper structure. But nonetheless, when they look at that, they find that the countries that have grown most rapidly aren't the ones that are specialised. It's the ones that have diversified industrial
Yeah.
structures. And the reason is you need neighbouring industries to be able to produce new industries. So my favourite example of how one of the ways in which innovation
You're not going to
occurs
talk
is
about
combining.
surfboards and sail, right?
Yes, you know that one. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, well, I'm going to stick with it
Give it
anyway.
to
So,
it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Okay, so that you have surfboard manufacturer, sail manufacturer in the same country. You come up with a sailboard. Different countries, you won't even have the idea necessarily, and you certainly can't try out prototypes. So, because innovation involves developing something new, diversity assists you in achieving
Well,
that.
and going back to Amazon, that is a good example if it was a country, because it started to do stuff and then it expanded and it said, well, what do we need to do that? Well, we need we need more customers. Let's invent the Kindle. So they get into manufacturing, and then they started to sell more because they were shipping stuff out, and then they needed the infrastructure. So big vertical integration is basically what they've done, which is what countries need to do. And if you don't do that, then you just if you're a country that's just a bookstore, you will just sell books, and you won't be thinking about new ways of doing stuff. And that is the problem, isn't it? Then you become the Kodak, which is the exact opposite of Amazon. Here was a company that sold film, didn't even make cameras. And in fact, when the digital age began, they started to make digital cameras. But then they got worried because they thought, we're selling these digital cameras, it's eating away our revenue selling film. So even when they look to the future, they backed out of it. And now, I mean, they do sort of scrimp, and they've just managed to just about survive, because there's still some specialist needs for films, for cameras.
Film.
But that's all they do. And they are, well, let me tell you, they went from turnover of 40 billion in today's money, in its heyday. It's now making about 250 million.
Oh my God!
So a disaster for a company that just did not diversify. So So it's not. It's just actually the thinking through of what you do next. Which, if you only do one thing, you don't think too much about what you do next, because you just assume. This gets back to the whole thing about time. You just assume that things will always stay the same.
And they don't. Yeah, I mean this is one case where a cliche makes a lot of sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. So, but comparative advantage says, put all your eggs in one basket. And assuming there's no technological change, that will never be a problem. Sorry about the assumption. But it's just not realising that diversification lets you change direction if the one you've down doesn't work out to be as sustaining as you thought it was going to be. And equally, the capacity to consider different ways of doing things comes from a diversity, not from specialisation.
But if you do have the advantage of having resources which are unique to you, it's just human nature, isn't it, that you're going to milk that for as much as you can. And there's only so much investment dollars available. And if those investment dollars can go into furthering that industry that's got growth involved in it, until you reach the point where you've been surpassed by something else, you're just going to accept that. So Saudi Arabia is still largely oil based. New Zealand is largely driven by dairy. Brazil, coffee, soybeans. We're not seeing a lot of diversification. Central Africa, which you think would have the potential to diversify, but doesn't, because they're small and they're poor. So would Brazil, for example, be better off if it had specialized less in the resources that it had, and went more into industrial production, for example, or more into
or
technology?
use those, like in the sense Norway has done that to some extent by siphoning off a lot of the export revenues into their huge investment fund, and then developing the technology that's needed to exploit the oil. So Norway's been an expert in building the machinery that's needed to extract the oil, whereas the comparative advantage would say, buy that equipment from somebody else. No, they've made it as the basis of an industry which has dramatically increased the technological level of the country. So it's, and because the classic case where you don't do that actually used to be called the Dutch disease. Because I think it was because of North Sea oil that Holland would exploit, and therefore what happened was its currency back when they had a currency, got overvalued by the currency rose in value because of the natural resources exports, which meant the manufacturing sector was handicapped by that higher exchange rate. And that's what's called the Dutch disease. But in classic countries like Australia have fallen down to that trap by just focusing upon that and not building an industry on top of the resources. So you can end up being stymied by the fact that you have a highly profitable and vital export. It means your other capabilities decline in as a consequence of that, driving up your exchange rate.
I mean, it's interesting, this trade deal that's supposedly been struck between the United States and Australia for rare earth minerals would see that Australia doing more onshore processing rather than shipping it necessarily all off to the United States, but doing it with American money. It's like, well, why do you need American money if you're making so much money out of all the stuff that you're selling?
Well, you might need to buy American machinery to do the processing, quite possibly. But equally, if you need Chinese, then but you're going to be converting that into Chinese renminbi. But again, it's not having the domestic capability to construct those industries and build on them afterwards. Because if the manufacturing standards fall, you don't have the machine tools industry, you don't have the machine tools engineers to make the machines that make the machines that make the products. And that's the that's the huge gap in this way of thinking. Whereas countries that have done the diversification approach, and that was once Germany. Germany's doing a pretty bad job these days, but China, Japan, South Korea, all these countries diversified rather than specialising, and they've performed far better because of it.
Yeah. So Brazil's an interesting one in that, they've got a lot of resources. They've got a big balance of trade surplus and yet very low GDP per capita, even though they're exporting a lot of resources simply because they've not diversified. So for whatever reason, because it's easy not to, I guess. But
it's certainly a temptation. This is the trouble. Economics encourages you to do the worst possible things for your future. And that's like I use the example of lying in a beanbag, getting stoned and drinking wine. That's higher utility than going to the gym. So why don't you do that every day? You'll look like the beanbag in 20 years' time. You'll have a heart attack, but boy, would you have enjoyed your life on the way to being a wreck? Yeah. Whereas it's even like in terms of gambling criteria. There's a thing called the Kelly criteria. Ever heard of that?
No.
Okay, it's a way to maximise your potential for gains from gambling through time. So if you have $100 to bet on some process, whether it's a casino or a share market, pardon me, I try to get away with those, and you make it obvious it wasn't a slip. You rather than betting a whole 100 every time, you bet, say, $25. The Kelly criteria works out what the amount is, and that says even if it is true that you maximise your potential for gain or by investing everything at once, you shouldn't. So economics actually says no. This gambles. The expected value of this gamble's greater than the price of buying in. Bet the lot.
Right. And even then they go, you bet the lot now because then you'll get the benefit straight away rather than splitting it into 4 installments and getting the benefit over time.
But in fact, you end up with less over time because what actually is going on is a geometric mean process of compounding over time, not the arithmetic average that their mathematics has worked upon. So again, it's all this logic which is grown out of a fallacy of believing that what applies at a point in time is the best guide of what to do over time. That's completely false. And that's the basis of comparative advantage. It's the basis of specialisation. It's the basis of the MMT attitude about exports and imports. There's so many ways these economists seem to fall into this errant logic. More so than any other discipline.
So if you need to diversify, can you do it without tariffs? Because obviously the biggest proponent of diversifying now is Donald Trump, isn't it? He's saying, bring it all in. We want to diversify our economy. We want to produce more domestically than before. And he's really talking about what we're talking about. We might give him a hard time, but everything he's talking about.
In that sense, sometimes his gut sentiments are accurate. The reason he got elected was he could say there's a disenfranchised rump of the working class and middle class people who used to vote for the Democrats who are being screwed by the fact that the Democrats had aligned themselves with Wall Street, and financialisation was being pushed by the Democrats rather than workers' rights. And he's come in and says, "I'll do it for you." Now he's a con man, so he hasn't done what he said he would do, but he's picked up on that sentiment properly. And yes, a major way that countries which did successfully diversify and build industrial strength, like South Korea, like Japan, like China now, was restricting imports and enabling domestic industries to develop over time with some protection, but with the threat, and practiced in actual government policy by both those countries, particularly Japan, was that the tariff protection is going to fall over time. So unless you get your industry up to speed and become more competitive, more technologically advanced or more diversified than the countries you're competing with, you're going to lose that advantage and fail. So put the pressure on to invest. And that's what point you made earlier, that investment and what you do over time, that's what is the focus of improving your trade performance, not specialisation of what you're capable of right now.
It hasn't got to that second part, but, presumably, that might be part of the plan. But, I mean, how do you do that when you've got countries which are so much cheaper to produce stuff or so much more further down the track? So, for example, China electric vehicles now, they're all coming from China because the cost of labor is so much lower there. They've got about 70% of the global lithium ion production on the planet right now. So they're in a position to use the resources they've got to make something that they see the rest of the world needs, and they can do it far cheaper, half the price, I think, than most other places.
Yeah, I mean, China's got so far ahead. It's still got, not a long way to go to catch up to per capita living standards in America. When you do the adjustment and see what the cost of living actually is over there, rather than just raw GDP, with what they call purchasing price parity, it's a lot wealthier than the straight comparison makes it out to be, but still further to go. But it's such a technological lead that the thought of a country saying we're going to produce an electric car industry to compete with China, no, you're not.
Yeah.
So that's the dilemma. They've got such a technological advantage. The rest of the world can just look and shrug. That's one reason why when I've spoken to some of the political parties in the UK recently, I've said what you should focus upon is food production, because you don't have that same technological disadvantage you have with manufactured goods, and you're going to need food security in the future, given what global warming is going to throw our way. And that will at least mean you don't suffer the same leakage of revenue overseas buying foreign products, and maybe with the infrastructure you need to build an industrialised agricultural sector. Like in the sense of, you would have seen the strawberry production coming out of Dyson. Have you seen that? Okay, he's taken his technologies for engineering and building plants that build vacuum cleaners into plants that build plants, and very, very cleverly worked out, and now meaning that it's replacing a lot of the strawberries that used to be imported from overseas. And then because of all the technology involved in that, that gives you the capacity to think about other industries. So I think China's so far ahead in high-scale manufacturing and high-tech that countries which have made the mistake of specialising or made the mistake of going to services rather than manufacturing, which is the UK's original sin, get your food production up domestically, and then from that basis you might start developing the machine tools capabilities to have some chance of competing against China in other industries.
Fair enough, because I was about to say, by saying specialising in food while they specialise in cars sounds a bit like Ricardo's competitive advantage theory to me. That
It said if you got to start somewhere. Yeah. And this is the whole idea of the Atlas of economic complexity, as well as saying, measuring countries' complexity levels. It's also saying what industries do you have that have a capability to do that rapidly, and what you need is adjacency. You need to have at least some foundation that you can build something else on. So in food production, you've already got, food systems, you've already got some engineering. It's now put the two together and see what you can generate. Yeah. And then that might mean you end up having less money going overseas, less of your domestic money going to imports, and maybe you've got a chance to develop your industrial capabilities from that foundation.
Yeah, well, so the UK actually doesn't too bad in that ranking. Actually, surprisingly, it's I'm looking at the Observatory of Economic Complexity. The most complex economies are Japan, Switzerland, South Korea, Germany, Singapore, Czech Republic, Austria, and the UK is in 8th place. And so it's not just because it's because we've got aerospace as well as financial services. We've got aerospace.
Yeah, there's a bit of.
We've got
I mean,
pharmaceutical.
also like you're just working from the database of what the country exports.
Yeah.
You're not working from the database of what the country's actual industries are. So the SITC, Standard Industrial Technology Classification, I think it stands for, and because exports have to go through you're going to do exporting goods, you've got to go through customs and things like that. The data is collected, whereas the data at that level of detail for domestic manufacturing just isn't there. So I think there's some elements in which the data that they're using is slightly misleading in how you measure those actual complexity rankings. I don't think the UK would rank us as highly if you included the entire domestic manufacturing sector.
Right. But the example you gave where, say the UK went down this road of producing more food domestically, big greenhouses or however they do it, they up production, you start to get a more profit coming out of that sector. There's a room to do an Amazon then, from a bookstore to this global entity, maybe from a company growing strawberries to a company that's, does something else similar because it's getting...
No, that's the thing. You need the skills you need to make machines that make strawberries will be skills which can be transferred and pushed in other directions. Right. But you need the skill base. Right. And that's what the diversification gives you.
Okay, so you build that skill base. You're also making profit that you can reinvest, so you can go further down that road, so that so you're not relying entirely on foreign investment. Companies are reinvesting the profits that they're making, which is fine. It's impossible for small countries, though, isn't it? Because those small
this is one of the dilemmas. Yeah, you're a small country. You've got to think in terms of regions. So, and that's the scale of manufacturing that exists today is something which most of us don't have any exposure to because most of us don't work in factories. It's the process workers who work in places like Tesla, like Dyson, and so on and so forth. They've got an idea of the scale of this modern manufacturing, but it's huge, and so. It's.
But you're always those small countries, I should say. I mean, first of all, they can't. They can't make. They're not going to make the profits for the companies within it to be able to diversify. They're not going. They're going to be. They're not going to attract a lot of foreign investment to diversify because they'd be seen as being relatively high risk countries as well. So they've got no choice but to actually specialize. They'll go, well, we can.
Or they form sensible trading blocks. Yeah. And that's what the sensible side of the European Union was, a trading bloc that meant that you could have the whole of Europe as your market rather than just your individual countries. And that was a good idea. And the idea was therefore you'd have, rather than getting a Czech producer of competitive cars, you'd get a European producer of competitive cars, and then you'd have to work out which regions do you have specialising in which industries to give you a diversified system with reasonable scale.
Right. But if you're spoiled, if you're Australia and you can make money from mining and, other industries, obviously like selling houses, you're not going to focus on doing anything else. Like it's cheaper to buy stuff in. Why would you... I mean, this does become a case of comparative advantage, doesn't it? Why would you make?
It becomes a case of laziness.
but it's laziness supporting Ricardo a little bit. It's like we don't make clothes because it's cheaper to buy clothes from overseas.
Well, that's the advantage of an export surplus and an absolutely critical mineral. Yeah. Okay. Now the thing is, coal is one of the critical minerals that Australia is specialised in. What happens on the day, and it will come, when we realise, holy shit, we can't burn this anymore. We're literally driving ourselves extinct. Let's ban coal. Yeah. Now, that sort of technology, and that on the other side, you get improvements in efficiency of solar, new nuclear coming out. I saw a piece, just a graph on the typical thing on Twitter. China's nuclear is about 1/5 or 1/6 the cost per watt of European. So you can't compete with that sort of advantage.
Well, that's another issue, and that becomes another issue.
That's going to undercut coal and bang if it does.
There's countries that have got an advantage, have got natural advantage, So if you're looking at that comparative advantage, the whole theory about comparative advantages, we've all got exactly the same capability. isn't
which
it?
we
But we
don't.
don't.
Yeah, and the same endowments, which
Yeah.
we don't. So like the one, Australia will be screwed when we finally get nuclear power that's cheaper and much cheaper than coal, and then. And that sort of thing means that unless you have a diversified structure, you rely upon things not changing.
And yet, so Australia, I'm looking for where it is. It ranks very low in that.
At 90th, isn't
Yeah,
it?
something like that. Actually, I've got it as 105th, actually,
Yeah,
out of
yeah,
145 countries in the index. So it's way down at the bottom.
yeah. Which means as soon as they can't sell their coal anymore, then they can't produce anything domestically either of the capacity to maintain their level of income per capita. It's so you specialisation traps you. You've got only one. You've got your eggs in one basket. You better damn hope the basket doesn't get broken.
Well, there's a warning for Australia, but I mean, it's a warning that's been made
Which
for
they won't listen to.
decades.
Yeah.
But well, they won't listen because
Yeah.
everyone's got a very nice house, and they individually everyone goes, well, if push comes to shove, we'll sell our house and go and buy a small country in Africa for the price of our semi-detached.
There you go.
All right, very good. We'll catch you again next week, Steve. See you then.
Okay, Matt. See you then. Bye.